Okay, well, I think people will probably continue trickling in, but maybe we'll just get started because we have a lot to get through in the next hour. So thank you all for being here. My name is Michelle Cyca. I'm the Bureau Chief of Conservation Fellowships here at the Narwhal. And this is our webinar on First Nations in BC that are leading the clean energy transition. It's part of our Generating Futures series, which is made possible by generous support from the Real Estate Foundation of BC. And before we get started, I just want to say the Narwhal is committed to upholding the principles of truth and reconciliation in our work. So I just want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, which is recently known as Vancouver, BC. I grew up in Vancouver, and so did my parents, actually. So I'm a second-generation Vancouverite, but my family comes from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory. And my ancestors also came from Scotland and Germany and Sweden. I see many of you are doing this already, but if you'd like to share in the chat where you live and what First Nations and Indigenous peoples call those territories home, please do. In case you're not familiar with the Narwhal, just a little bit about us. We are an almost 8-year-old digital publication, and we are focused on in-depth and investigative journalism about the natural world here in Canada. And this conversation is focused on BC and features some of our BC reporters, but we also have teams in the prairies and in Ontario, and we do cover stories from all across Canada. The Narwhal is a nonprofit journalism outlet, and we're supported by more than 7,000 members who make the work we do possible. And if you're not yet a member of the Narwhal and you join today, you will get a very exciting Narwhal tote bag as a reward. It's great for carrying groceries, library books, whatever you need to haul around. And we're just going to drop a little poll in the chat to see who's already a member, something we always like to find out. So you'll see a little pop-up on screen. Take a second to answer if you don't mind. Oh, I can't vote in it. I'm the host. Oh, amazing. Thank you to the 62% of you who are already members, and I hope the rest of you are enticed by our beautiful tote bags and our great journalism. Just a couple more housekeeping notes, and then we'll get to the good stuff. So this session is being recorded. It will be available on our website afterwards if you'd like to watch it again, share with your friends. And as attendees, you'll also have access to the chat transcription after the meeting. We are providing automated closed captioning, so you can turn that on using the control panel at the bottom of your screen or select caption settings to control the size of the captions. You should be able to move them around, customize them. If you have technical issues, you can ask for support in the chat. And lastly, thanks to everybody who submitted questions in advance. We got more than 60 and all of them are great. So we've selected a couple that we'll be getting to towards the end of this session. But you're welcome to drop questions in the chat anytime. Some of our wonderful narwhals will be in there monitoring them. All right, into the good stuff. So as mentioned, this event is part of Generating Futures. We have 3 of the reporters who have contributed stories to this series, which is about First Nations in BC who are leading energy projects on their territories. And the series is inspired in part by the clean energy goals in BC and the attempts to decarbonize our economy. BC has a very ambitious target of reducing emissions 40% below 2007 levels by 2030. And just a little spoiler alert, they are not on track at all to meet this goal, as Steph, who's part of our webinar today, has reported. Currently, or recently, many of the provinces' climate goals and ambitions have actually been scaled back or canceled altogether, which is not great news for the climate. But what is great news is that we are seeing First Nations and Indigenous communities across BC that are implementing and developing some really exciting clean energy projects on their territories. And we're going to talk about a few of those today. So I'm going to introduce our 3 reporters who've joined us today, starting with Zoë Yunker. You can wave, Zoe. Zoe's a freelance journalist who we're really lucky to work with often here at the Narwhal. So you've probably seen her byline before, and she's also a frequent flyer over at the Tyee. Zoe reports on forestry, on climate, on energy issues. She's an incredible reporter. And she's working on a couple of stories for the Generating Future series. So the first was about the Inclepkamic First Nations journey to build BC's first major solar project. This is the first story in the series. And she also published another one recently about the West Moberly First Nations and their plans to tap geothermal reserves in their territories. Anything you want to add, Zoe? Feel free to say hi.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just really stoked to be here, and it's been so fun to work on these pieces as part of the series. And yeah, I'm a settler of European descent, many places, mostly Italy and England and other parts of Europe. And yeah, that's it.
Thanks so much, Zoe. Also, for those of you who are following along, you will be seeing links in the chat if you want to read any of these stories or take a look at them as we go through. Next up, I'm happy to introduce Steph Kwetásel'wet Wood, who's part of our BC team here at the Narwhal. She's a Squamish journalist living and writing on Squamish territory. Steph writes about all kinds of things here at the Narwhal: Indigenous rights, hunting, conservation, food sovereignty, and for Generating Future, she wrote a beautiful story about the Katsino First Nation, which is on the very tip of Vancouver Island, and their efforts to harness different kinds of energy to make their community more self-reliant and sustainable. Happy to have Steph here. If you want to say hello, Steph.
Hello, Hatsquat'wet. Happy to see you all. Good day.
And last but not least, I'm really excited to introduce you to Santana Dreaver. She's our Indigenous Journalism Fellow for 2026. So she's one of the newest people here at the Narwhal. She's joined us for 1 year in a position that's supported by the Cyca Foundation. And Santana traveled recently to Nanaimo, BC for a directional gathering by Indigenous Clean Energy, which was one of 5 gatherings that brought together over 200 Indigenous leaders in the energy space. You want to say hi, Santana?
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's really cool seeing all the different territories that are here. Yeah, thanks for listening and excited to share space with everyone today.
Thanks, Santana. Thanks, Steph and Zoe. So I'm excited to get into the conversation after all the intros, all the preamble. And I want to start with just a roundtable question for each of you to answer. So each of your stories felt like it was really rooted in a specific place, specific territory. And I was curious how you think the lands and waters of each First Nation are affecting or influencing how that nation is thinking about energy and energy projects. Maybe I will start with Steph.
Yeah. So for Quetzino First Nation, like you said, they're on the northern tip of Vancouver Island. It's a smaller community. It's a 6-hour drive-ish from Victoria, and it's a land defined by wind and storms. It's right on the ocean. That's central to the life there. But with those wind and storms kind of barreling down Quetzino Sound, that also means that they're subject to a lot of power outages, and the remoteness affects what their needs and priorities are in terms of energy, and what the community needs for stability and self-sufficiency. There's basically 2 ways in and out, pretty much. If there's a storm, the forest road might not be stable, the water might be too tumultuous, and so they're really looking for ways to make it safe and comfortable for people to stay at home if there are storms coming through. So what they're looking to do is to use some of those features actually as a strength for their energy purposes. And so they are already working with a wind farm, and they're in partnership with the wind farm that's owned by another company. And they're also exploring tidal and deploying their first test this year, which is pretty exciting because there's been a lot of tests in BC. It's not something that's really gotten off the ground yet. They're hoping to be on kind of the front cutting edge of that. And yeah, this is all part of their broader vision of bringing self-sufficiency to their community. They've also done a solar project, just completing this spring, to power several of their community buildings. And they're trying to, live with, again, like use these features that are part of their land, and it defines how they live and what resources they have available. And then they and other First Nations are also considering the impacts of climate change that's happening on their land as well. So they were looking to diversify the ways that they're using energy as we see, temperatures change and water levels change. They're trying to diversify where they're getting those energy sources, and kind of closely intertwining emergency planning, community planning, energy planning all together, so that homes, energy, food, etc. will all be protected.
Thanks, Steph. I'm going to go to Zoe next, but I just want to mention a couple folks in the chat said your audio has gotten a little bit quieter. If you can turn it up a tiny bit.
Thank you. I will try to work on that. Thank you.
And hopefully my audio is sounding better, thanks to those who flagged that it's a little quiet. All right, Zoe, up to you.
Yeah, so I'll start off talking. Oh, and let me know if my audio is sounding muffled on mine as well.
Your audio sounds perfect.
Okay, good. So yeah, the Inkleketan Tribal Council has developed a solar project in their territory, which is in the central southern interior of BC, which works because it's extremely sunny in that area. There's a lot of sun. I think BC often gets sort of a bad rap for solar because, it is true that on the coastal areas, there's lots of rain and there's not as much sun throughout the year. But in the central interior, there actually is a lot of sun. It's comparable to some parts of Alberta and other parts of the country that get a lot more solar. And it's not to say that solar doesn't work on the coast, but definitely works really well in this particular area. And I guess I would say, I'll touch on this maybe more later, but the project that they've been working on, part of the engagement with communities for that was determining like what communities would value, what other sort of supports would make sense. And so they've been installing solar panels on community homes because they were hearing that, during like wildfire season and those sort of climate emergencies, people want to make sure they still have power and have a way to communicate as a safety measure. So that's another thing they're looking at. And then geothermal is also very location specific. And I loved learning about this, but it turns out that the northeastern part of the province, many, many, many millions of years ago, actually used to be like a shallow sea floor. Incredible, which was covered over by, tectonic movements and plates and things like that, was covered over with rock and sediment and has since become very, very buried. But that seafloor actually holds this salty brine that is very hot because it is very, very deep. And they can actually tap that hot water to create a stable sort of baseload power, which is really important because it is ready all the time. And I'll talk more about this, but their project is using that, wants to use that power to power a greenhouse in their territory. So yeah, that's a very, very neat project that helped me learn a bit about geothermal potential in BC.
Thank you, Zoe. I've also changed my audio settings, so I'm using my computer audio. Hopefully it sounds a little bit better for everybody. Santana, what about you? I know you were at a different kind of gathering that brought people together from all over the place, but there was a cool land-based teaching element to that gathering I thought you might want to share.
Yeah, so the directional gatherings were hosted in 5 different gatherings, and I'll speak more about them later. But coming from Saskatchewan, where we're very like oil and gas focused, we don't have the ocean to power energy through hydroelectric dams, and that's been the real history in British Columbia. Is BC Hydro, producing a lot of their electricity through these hydroelectric dams, and so now that nations are really reclaiming projects in their territories. As Zoe was saying, a lot of nations are implementing solar. And those were the 2 real stories that I heard in Nanaimo. Sean, and his last name is passing me right now, I apologize, but from Haida Gwaii in Masset. was in Nanaimo speaking about their nation's solar plant, and it's like the first Indigenous solar plant in BC. So we're seeing these new ways of implementing energy in the province, highly through wind projects and solar projects. So yeah, that was kind of what I saw, and was different from the territory I come from. BC focused. And another part of that was seeing youth as well, Indigenous youth who live in urban territories at the gathering. They're interning with Clean Energy BC, and they're leading different energy groups, youth fellowships in their communities specific to Haida Gwaii. So I just thought that was an interesting way of how the energy industry was implemented in the province, but seeing where it goes and how nations, maybe they don't need a solar plant, but are doing small scale projects through solar throughout the province and through wind.
Thanks so much, Santana. That's a nice transition into the next question that I have for Zoe, which is about how some of these projects are being funded. So BC Hydro now, after not investing in this really for a couple of years, is looking for non-hydro renewable projects to partner on, and is requiring those projects to have an Indigenous ownership component to them. But the two projects that you've written about so far for this series both wouldn't really be eligible for that funding stream. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the projects that fall outside of it and what we should keep in mind about them.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, it is really notable that the projects now require Indigenous ownership. That certainly was not the case before this. So, that is a really notable thing to point out. But I think there are some projects that leaves out. And so basically, BC Hydro, the projects that it's currently looking for are projects that are very large and that are connected to the grid. And so, to back up, I guess, for folks that maybe aren't familiar with BC, we have a monopoly utility, and it has, it exists because of Indigenous territories and the resources that they have provided. So as Santana was mentioning, dams and transmission lines and things like that. But the utility still decides when it wants to buy power, how much it wants to buy the power for, and who it's going to buy it from. So that does really limit the opportunities often available to communities that are wanting to participate. And so the projects that I looked at don't fall into this current sort of movement towards these really big projects that are grid connected, but I think in the process of reporting them, learned how important they are and some of the values that they are following for communities that have decided that they want them to be shaped this way. So the first one was, in Clinton territory in the central interior. They developed a solar project. And it's sort of counterintuitive, maybe, that this actually isn't part of this large scale call for power. But in fact, it's actually this project in particular is a lot smaller than the projects that the BC Hydro is currently looking for. So again, the reason, they wouldn't have really been able to participate in this call for power. The reason that they were able to do this project at a smaller scale was a story that goes way back to a court case back in 2011, where basically the outcome of this was that consultation around a transmission line going through their territory, the Utilities Commission hadn't sort of properly looked at that and considered First Nations consultation when they decided on it. And so as part of an accommodation through that successful court case that they launched, they were able to get an energy purchase agreement with BC Hydro. So they said, okay, we're going to buy power from you. Then it took at least another decade for BC to come up with the tax code that would allow for solar. And so that is a very long saga that I sort of talked about in my piece. And Chief Matt Pascoe and Lookout Tribal Council made some really fascinating points about, the sort of fast track conversation and what this solar project says in the context of that. But yeah, so basically, now they have the solar project, which is about 15 megawatts, which is a fifth of the size of what the call for power is generally a fifth of the size of what the call for power would accept. However, because they did this smaller project, they were able to be ready when the BC Hydro made another call for power, it actually had pretty short timelines. And so they said, this experience developing the smaller project was really, really integral to being able to hop onto this. And so they are now creating the second grid scale solar project in the province. Chief Matt Pascoe, actually, I loved this quote. He said, "We're going to crush the current largest solar project with our own solar project." And he said that, that experience was really integral to them being able to do that. Yeah, and then really quick on geothermal. So geothermal, the project that the West Moberly First Nation is working on is a geothermal project in their territory, and they are looking at direct heat, which gets a little bit technical, but basically direct heat is it's a bit easier to develop a geothermal project that is direct as opposed to creating electricity from it. So you need really high heat to create electricity, and you need lots of flow from the water. And so for the community, having a lower risk profile and based on what they knew about the area, it made sense to go for a direct heat project. Luckily, direct heat works really well with greenhouses. It creates a steady supply of power. And for the community, they know that fresh foods and access to fresh foods is in a really tough spot right now. They've had huge fragmentation in the territory. Hydro dam reservoirs have created mercury poisoning in a lot of their fish sources, and just getting fresh food to that end of the province, it's quite far up in the northeast, is really challenging. So the greenhouse for them is like a really critical project that could create a stable supply of fresh produce and potentially fish. They're looking at an aquaponic system for their community and also for the surrounding communities, which is a value that they're really interested in moving towards. Yeah, and so I think these two projects really show that there's a lot of really important values that communities might be interested in that don't necessarily fall into this structure, and yeah, can talk a bit more about maybe the barriers to that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zoe. I think one thing that stands out in your stories too is just like what a long timeline it often is for communities to bring these ideas from like where they start envisioning them and identify the needs and priorities that they have until they have a power source. It can be a decade or more. And in the case of West Moberly, like there's a lot of kind of risk too, or like perceived risk with a more experimental form of power that can make it challenging to move forward. So there's a lot of like resilience in these stories, just in having to keep pushing. Steph, I want to go to you next because Casino similarly has designed a lot of its energy projects around the needs of the community and kind of their goals for what they see as really important or what their priorities are for what energy can provide. And like a lot of First Nations in BC, it's quite a remote community. Like you said, there's only kind of one way in by road and one way in by water. So what does that reality of being quite isolated mean for them as they're thinking about power and how it can provide more self-reliance for the community?
Yeah, much like Zoe was talking about, it means self-reliance really is like the goal versus selling energy and making a bigger project. Also definitely weigh in the chat if there's anything wrong with my audio again. I tried to change it. But yeah, so for Kwetásel'wet, the goal is really being self-reliant. self-reliant in the face of storms, and having it be one piece of the puzzle and helping keep people home in the community as well. Because again, all these issues are connected, and stuff to do with housing affordability, stuff to do with lack of work, like all these interrelated factors could also affect the stability of a community and stability and, staying in your community. And so that's another piece of it that Kara Wilson, the person I interviewed, was talking about, how can we create jobs? How can we lower the cost of housing and utilities to make it so people can stay home and not always feel like they have to leave and go to the city and then be hours away from home. So again, like all of this stuff is kind of very, very holistically connected. They prioritized bringing the solar panels to a lot of these community buildings, like back up these services and resources that serve the entire community. And then they're talking about also serving homes down the line. Again, different stuff makes sense for different communities. And another piece of it is how can they get started from really not having all of that capacity. And a big part of that has been partnerships. A big group is called the Barclay Group, and they're like a renewable energy consultant, and they worked with Quetzino to help create the community energy plan. And they've also worked with other First Nations, like Tlokriet out near Tofino, to eventually, to get into a run-of-river hydro project, and then eventually, once they were ready, get ownership later. And so I know that there's a lot of talk of how can we do this stuff so that the First Nation can get into the work and then build up the capacity to then get ownership down the line. So partnerships have also been a really big part to pursue that self-reliance that, again, like Zoe said, can take a very long time to have the idea, to the plan, to the build it, to the full self-reliance can take a very long time.
Yeah, definitely a lot of stages to move through. And thanks for bringing in the partnerships piece, because that feels like a really big part of all of this work, and a theme throughout these stories. Thinking about the long timelines of these projects, Santana, you were at a directional gathering, which was really focused, I think, on like what participants want to see for the future, what they're kind of looking for in their communities down the line in terms of energy projects. And I was wondering what the kind of themes were that emerged from that conversation in terms of how communities are thinking about the future of power.
Yeah, so there was people from all over Canada in Nanaimo. I think there's people from like Northwest Territories, people from Colombia, someone raised in South Korea, and really all over Canada, which really tells me that like people look up to BC and they want to come to this province to learn about clean energy. And I think that's especially real in the Indigenous community. Just coming from Saskatchewan myself, we really look up to what nations are doing here, legislatively, with policy, with many things. And I think that was true for this gathering. And so really, I want to dive into your question more, but the purpose of this gathering was more so to connect with one another. I was there for one day of session where we had breakout rooms, which were very specific. I have the document here, and they have different themes and like housing and policy, funding, and culture and community. But really, I think the purpose was, and the message that I received was, our communities are quite small. I think when you grow up in an Indigenous community, it's your whole world, and like you really feel like, I don't know, Avengers, like you've survived all of this and you're gonna keep surviving. But in reality, we are like quite a small population. And so I think clean energy leaders can get really burnt out carrying on this work in their communities. In British Columbia, I know a lot of nations are very rural and remote. And when you're one of the only people, or maybe one of three people who are championing the energy transition, it can get very lonely and isolating. And so, what I think Indigenous clean energy really is prioritizing and trying to do with these directional gatherings is to bring people together to knowledge share. We don't have to recreate the wheel. It's going to look different in every nation depending on the land where you come from, whether like you're coastal, whether you're interior, you're from the prairie, like what have you. But really just to let people know they're not alone and to like give them that space to really just be together and to have peers to really just recharge and to go back to their territories to continue on that work, because not everyone's going to be, you know, an energy champion, and we have to have people in all different departments. And so I think what I really took out of it was maybe not so much what people are hoping for in the future, but really just a need to connect and to be with like-minded people to, again, just recharge and to continue on those projects. In Nanaimo, Steph's guest, sorry, what's her name, Stephanie, in your story?
Kara Wilson.
Kara Wilson, she was there, and what was really special was that um, Kara was there with her chief and council. They had maybe 4 people along with her. And I thought that was really special that their leadership is really making an effort to be here to learn in person, because a theme I see when I travel and I'm at these events is a lot of young people are trying to implement projects, but they don't really have buy-in from their chief and council. So I think Steph's story is a really good example of when leadership buys in, projects can happen. And so I think there's a lot of people of all different ages and different at different levels of their energy journey, I guess you can say. Really just looking to connect and to know what works, what doesn't work, and to just have that support that maybe they don't have back home in their community. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks for sharing that, Santana. I mean, a lot of really great insights there. I think it is worth remembering, you know, there's over 200 First Nations in BC, and a lot are quite small. And often these projects are kind of being spearheaded by one person who might be like a one-person department. And so finding ways to connect and support each other and learn from one another's work, I think is really valuable. And I love that you mentioned Kara having her chief and council there. Another detail that I really love from your story is the participant who brought her 2-year-old along with her, and just seeing how multi-generational a lot of these gatherings are, and kind of bearing in mind that, you know, people are coming at this from different generational perspectives, and carrying each other along. So I love that you brought that up. And as we move into questions that were submitted by folks who registered, I think also what you said about thinking holistically about energy and how it fits with all these other community priorities, and is kind of like one piece of a bigger picture and a bigger vision, flows really nicely into the first question that we have from Larissa, which is how are energy projects ameliorating or integrating other health and wellness benefits into their design, operation, or outcomes? And Steph, I know you had a story that came to mind when we saw this question.
Yeah, a few things came to mind. Again, that holistic approach that we just hear tons of people telling us about. And, you know, these community energy plans, they're going to community members and asking, what are your priorities? And a lot of the time that is part of it. There's taking care of the land, there's enabling connection to the land while pursuing sustainable energy and, you know, creating better homes and creating more self-sustaining communities. It's just always all connected. So with Quetzino, for example, one of their goals is they're hoping that with these energy sources that they're creating for themselves, it's going to help power their culture camp that's in one of their old village sites. And they're hoping that that's going to be a deliverable that they're able to do. Healthsick First Nation up in Bella Bella similarly was trying to combine the two, talking about how can clean energy enable healthier homes? How can it enable, you know, all of the priorities our community members have for themselves, and really bring community health to the center of that? And even really, really specific things like the fact that in a remote First Nation, people are much more likely to have a lot of food stocked in the freezer, and a power outage can, you know, cause a really, really major effect on that fresh food, that fish and game that might be in those freezers. So how can they make sure that there's sustainable energy to keep all those freezers running and to have the community center going? And then, like I mentioned before, also with what energy they're going to pursue. Quetzino specifically had community members voice concerns about the hydrology, low waters, salmon returns, and so they wanted to see what else can we do outside of hydropower? What else is there? And so that land health then informed the energy decisions that they were trying to make. So the one thing that you will definitely hear a lot every time you try to ask, you know, maybe a question that might separate an issue, you're always going to have someone connecting all of these things and showing how food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, affordability, all of that stuff is going to be connected in this area.
Thanks so much for that, Steph. So did you have something to add to this one as well?
Yeah, totally. I think one thing that I've heard quite a bit about is like thinking about how using the proceeds from the project. So for Inclicum, communities, there's talk around, okay, what would be the outcome that we could support with the revenue from developing solar in our territory? And Chief Matt Pascoe talked to me about, like an elders, a space where elders can come and live on the territory instead of having to move away to facilities that would be able to house them there so they can be around their families. Like that is a really key priority for them. So that's one of the things that they're hoping to support. I think I already mentioned the rooftop solar in the context of climate resilience and climate emergencies came through as one of the things that they're already doing as part of the sort of accommodation and working with communities while building the project. And then certainly the greenhouse project is really focused around like what does our community need going forward to be able to sustain ourselves and live here and have good food and be able to support other communities around us as well. So one really, and I touched on this earlier, but one of the really neat things about geothermal is that it is like a steady power supply, which is quite rare with renewables. Usually with solar and with wind, you've only got it when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining and things like that. So for the community, they've been funding funding sort of garden plots for folks' yards. But of course, in the winter in northeastern BC, it gets like -30. It's really cold. So that doesn't sustain you throughout the whole year. So having a steady power supply from geothermal could support a year-round food supply. Yeah.
Thanks, Zoe. I think a theme in your answers too with Inclicum and Katsino and West Moberly is just like thinking too about the effects of climate change and, more extreme temperatures, storm surges, wildfires, just all as events that need to be considered when developing an energy strategy and being able to plan for situations where, the power supply might be disrupted, access to the community might be disrupted, and building that resilience for the future. So just a theme that stood out to me in your answers. We had a question from Suzanne about project funding. I know we touched on this a little bit with the BC Hydro Call to Power, but there are a lot of projects and initiatives that do seem to fall a bit outside those calls for power, which are focused on quite large projects. So for the smaller scale projects, or the ones that are sort of really like focused on the community's needs at that kind of micro level, what funding sources are available? Or how are those projects being funded? Any thoughts on that?
I can hop in on that, and you might have more to add too, Zoe. But of course, there's some other government streams, some other funding that First Nations can access, but there's also been a really diverse array of partnerships. HealthTech has worked with University of British Columbia and other schools to get projects off the ground. University of Victoria worked with Quetzino, and then HealthTech also has worked with multiple banks like BMO and Van City, and then tons of other initiatives like New Relationship Trust. But yeah, as we talked about, the demand is actually really, really high. Quetzino wanted to apply for one of PC Hydro's rebate programs for solar panels, specifically for Indigenous communities, and they had to pause taking applications because there was such an influx of applications. And so there's this real, real high demand for it, and people are always trying to one of the first things they're all going to mention is that we need more funding, we need long-term funding, we need stable funding. And again, for smaller projects that don't have maybe as a typical payoff one might imagine, but the payoff is community resiliency and sustainability. It can take a lot of reaching. And then it also takes a lot of time to report on your deliverables and everything. And I know for HealthSec, hiring a full-time grant writer was huge just to be able to see through getting the funding necessary to see these projects through. And then there's a lag on being able to prove, like, here's the benefits that we've done. So it can really be a full-time job that not even every First Nation can initially have the capacity to have someone doing that role.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard a lot about the grant fatigue and the amount of time it takes to write the grants, and then the various pots that you have to draw from being like a huge demand on folks' time. Yeah, and I guess sort of connected to the sort of different scales of projects, I think funding streams really depend on what scale you're operating at. So for these large scale grid connected projects that BC Hydro is going out and buying, there's like a really clear sort of, okay, you're going to have this contract for the next however long, I think 20 years. So it's a really sort of stable thing. Folks can get investment pretty easily to support that. The Canada Infrastructure Bank has been, I understand, has been really pivotal in supporting nations' sort of share of the equity ownership portion. But then when it gets to either not grid connected projects or smaller projects, that's where things can get quite tricky. So smaller and grid connected, yeah, it's the same thing. So I know that there has been sort of a combination of federal and provincial funding available to those projects, which has been, I think, as of in the last 10 years, doing a lot of work, especially on sort of remote First Nations that have been developing projects. There has been funding available, even though it's not sort of getting the high rate of return that some investors might expect. Like there's low interest loans or there's grants, and those projects have been possible. One thing that I have heard is that folks sort of looking at budgets and funding patterns are saying, like reading the tea leaves and seeing a withdrawal of those funds starting to happen and potentially happening more and more. And so there are a lot of communities I know on the sort of remote community side that have developed projects. They've got them ready to go. They're like, yes, we want to do this and use less diesel on our grids. And now there's a question of whether or not they're going to be able to fund those projects because of these really pivotal funding pots at the federal level in particular are in question. So I think that's something to look at and to keep our eyes on, to be able to keep doing that work.
Thanks for bringing that up, Zoe. I mean, I think most folks can look and see that there's like a lot of projects that are in sort of the pilot stage. There's a lot of projects being trialed by First Nations communities. And it is, as Steph said, often like a full-time job for somebody to just keep that funding going or be applying for funding or reporting back on it. There can be a lot of barriers to sustainability for these projects, even when they have a lot of potential or like a strong kind of proof of concept. So I actually want to move to a question from Erwin, because I think this is probably something that a lot of people are thinking about and that I've seen a little bit in the chat already, which is what role businesses and individuals can play in supporting these Indigenous-led initiatives. Like what's a useful action that people could take today if they wanted to support more of these projects?
I can go.
Yeah.
I think if you want to be an ally to Indigenous-led initiatives, it's really just rethinking a project, and maybe it won't make sense to you. Like my colleagues here are saying, not everything needs to be revenue generating. And an example from when I worked at Cyca Solar is in my former colleague Serena Mendazabel's community. They solarized a wheelchair accessible sweat lodge, which if you're not Indigenous, you might see it and think it's like this little shack like well-built pretty shack on the outside, but that was might what you see. But for people who want to access ceremony, they have a solar-powered place where they can access a sweat lodge from a wheelchair, which is just something you don't really see across Canada. And it's something that makes a big impact for the aunties, the matriarchs, or the people who use wheelchairs. So supporting Indigenous-led initiatives sometimes just requires listening and not judging at first glance. Thanks.
I love that example, Santana. Thanks for bringing that up. And I mean, I think a lot of these projects too are really focused on like what are the community's needs. Like they have to be focused on this micro level of like ensuring that there's reliable power for emergency communications during a storm or during a wildfire. And those might not be always aligned with like a provincial level priority, but it reflects the needs of that specific community. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Zoe, Steph, any other thoughts?
Going off what Santana said a little bit, yeah, any sort of community initiatives, community spaces is huge. Even, we see spaces like this will connect people. Putting out one of our stories connect people and make connections we couldn't have even imagined. Like I know people reached out to Kara after I wrote my article. So little connections come from connections, and you never really know where that's going to go. And then knowledge sharing of any kind, if you are in this industry or know someone who is, that's something Kara was speaking a lot about, and like Santana spoke about, just bringing people together in some way to knowledge share, because a lot of the time people are starting from like a one person or a small department and not exactly knowing where to start, and people are so busy that bringing folks together to knowledge share can actually be huge. And that's something that Kara talked about as well, and just loving to share knowledge with anyone that she can about how they've gotten where they are. And then for every individual person, just that your citizen voice is a really powerful thing, even when it can feel like it isn't. And you can utilize it all the time to demand lots of questions, like the really smart questions going off in the chat right now. Like, why aren't you doing this? Why are you doing it this way? And use that accountability. It really does have a power to it.
That's right. Bug your MLAs and your MPs. That's what they're there for, to take your questions and your letters. I'll go to
I wanted to
you
just
go.
add yeah, definitely bug your MLAs, MPs, especially, in specific to the funding conversation, say like, this really matters to me. I want diverse sources of funding to be able to support these projects. I think,
Yeah.
always having those messages coming through cannot hurt. And then also, I guess, just one thing that I've realized over the course of reporting on some of this is just like the huge impact that our power system has had on Indigenous territories in BC. I mean, beyond BC, but, dams, transmission lines, this is really just, it's a huge impact. And there's been a real disproportionate experience of the consequences, the harms of power in the province. And for so many of us, for me, my whole life, it was just this invisible thing that you just turn on the light and it's there, but it really has taken a toll. And so I think learning as much as you can about what those impacts are and sharing that whenever you can, when you're in conversations, like I think right now in this climate, there's a real role for surfacing some of those inequities and making sure that folks that you're talking to are aware of them. So I think that's something that, settlers like me can take on.
Thank you for mentioning that, Zoe. That made me think of another story that Steph reported last year that I'm just going to drop in the chat about Katzie First Nation, which has been calling on BC Hydro to let more water through in the Alouette River, which was dammed for hydro. And it's a really beautifully photographed and beautifully reported story that gets into those impacts that you talk about and the kind of disproportionate impacts of our energy infrastructure that is invisible to so many of us, but has transformed a lot of the First Nations territories across BC. So thank you for mentioning that. We did have a question from Peter in the chat about whether the provincial or federal government considers First Nations consultation when making agreements for utilities resources. My understanding is that they are required to do consultation now. It's part of our legislation under DRIPA and UNDRIP. But I think in some of the stories that we've talked about today, you can see that many First Nations, I think, would say that the consultation has not always been adequate and is particularly challenging when you're looking at impacts from past projects, like the Alouette Dam, where, you know, current measures around consultation can't really provide redress for like decades of impacts on territories. I don't know if Steph or Zoë or Santana, you want to say anything about consultation in utilities?
I think those are probably the exact 2 points that I would have made, that consultation is often, there's debate on how much there was really consulting happening or just a box ticked. And then the legacy of existing projects and the cumulative effects of all of those projects intersecting. And First Nations often feeling like, again, for decades on end, they're kind of saying the same thing or pushing for the same thing, and that is not necessarily going anywhere. So yeah, moving to actions by government happening faster seems to be the thing I hear the most.
Yeah. And I also want to say a theme that comes through our stories and in a lot of our reporting, talking to First Nations, particularly smaller First Nations that have, you know, like a finite number of staff, or that are in areas where there are a lot of projects being proposed, is that consultation is essential. It's important, but it's a lot of work for these nations. Like, they have to consult with their members, they have to survey their territories. Like, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into it. And often you have First Nations that are really at the intersection of so many interests around energy projects or mining projects or forestry, where just like the burden of consultation is really, really high. And I think that's something that sometimes can get lost, where the intent to consult is good, the process of consultation is essential, but it's not really work that can be done in a really speedy fashion most of the time, and is often like quite a considerable burden for First Nations in BC and everywhere.
Yeah, and I remember Chief Matt Pasco talking a bit about this. It's like, how do we make sure that the people who are impacted from projects are seeing a share of the benefits, you know, as a really important part of developing these projects, and which requires sort of a willingness to open up the business model and think about all the different players, folks who can benefit from it. And then also just like the time, you know, like I think a lot of these, the calls for power have been very quick, and they require, you know, they make the call for power and then you need to respond really quickly. And it's being able to do that legwork of talking with different communities and making sure that you understand what people would like to see from the project, what would help them support it, is really challenging. So yeah. Echoing what folks are saying.
Yeah. And definitely something that stood out to me from your West Moberly story was, I can't remember if it was Chief Roland Wilson or if it was Clarence, who said, you know, that the impacts on their territory that they're trying to address through geothermal were not created by them. They were often the product of provincial projects like the Site C Dam. And so there is arguably a responsibility from the province and everyone in the province to consider how to ameliorate or make redress for those impacts. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
We just have a few minutes left. I do want to just ask each of you for your thoughts about, you know, now that you've spent some time thinking about these projects, exploring these communities through your reporting, what's something you're thinking about for the future, or something that you'd like to report more on in terms of First Nations-led energy projects? Steph, let's start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really excited to just follow some of these emerging technologies, especially tidal. I'm just so interested in it. And, you know, all the geothermal potential that people are so excited about and have been talking about for so long. So I'm really excited to see some of those technologies expand. And then, yeah, I just think we are at this exciting moment where there's so much interest. There is this catching up of capacity, and at the same time, there's still this lag of how there haven't been the resources up until this point, and so much has been disrupted and taken away. And so it really feels like we're at this pivotal point where things could really start to swing and momentum could be built. Not within First Nations and then more broadly with clean energy, it just feels like there's been all of this ramping up, and then people are waiting to see the payoff, people are waiting to see what's possible, and it really does feel like we are on the edge of a precipice in a way that I feel like so much will come out of. So I'm just excited to watch that.
Thanks, Steph. Zoe, what about you?
Yeah, definitely echoing what Steph's talking about. Like, it does feel like the technology, solar and wind and batteries and all these things have really changed in like a very short amount of time. And so things that are possible now that weren't possible a very short amount of time ago, which is really exciting. Like, I'm working on a story on remote communities right now, and seeing like what's possible with batteries now that can actually make small grids work in a very different way that with solar and wind and things like that is really exciting. And we've had Site C has been a big conversation in BC for a long time. It's been sucking up a lot of oxygen, and now there's finally acknowledgement like, okay, we need more energy and we need to do this. So I'm looking at the ways that we're doing that, like how are we getting this energy and who is that going to impact and who is benefiting sort of broadly. And then I've reported on this a little bit before, First Nations utilities, conversations around First Nations sort of taking on a role as utilities in the energy system. And there's lots of different ways that can look. And it's a conversation that's happening in lots of different places. But I think it really sort of grapples with this monopoly role that BC Hydro has played in the energy system around, deciding who gets power and who produces power, and, that there's an imbalance of decision making and equity there, that if we're taking our commitment to DRIPA really seriously, it's something that we need to look at. So there's lots of conversations happening around that, and I'm really interested in continuing to look at that.
Thanks, Zoe. And thanks for making sure everybody here knows there's more stories to come in the series that we're excited about. So I'm looking forward to your next one. Santana, do you have anything to add about what you're paying attention to or thinking about for the future?
Yeah, I'm really interested in retrofitting housing to be more sustainable. It's not really like my wheelhouse, but with emergency preparedness and like evacuations, earthquakes, making our homes more sustainable and safe is something I'm really interested in. We have such a housing shortage across all of Canada, and Dakota Marsden actually really inspired me about this at the Nanaimo gathering when she told me her mentor was very interested in housing, something I don't think about too much. So it's something I want to learn more about and hope to see what nations all over BC and Canada are doing in that respect. And also food sovereignty. The cost of like food is so crazy. So I really want to see what nations are doing to like have more sustainable methods. I already know like so many friends can and do their own things. So very interested in learning more about that in the energy space. Thank you.
Thanks, Santana. Definitely always fun to see how all of these things fit together. Food sovereignty and food security, housing, energy, climate resilience, all pieces of a bigger whole. So thanks to all three of you for such a great discussion today. And to everybody who joined, I love seeing such an active chat and all of these wonderful questions. So really grateful to everybody for spending the last hour with us. I'm sorry if we didn't have a chance to get to your questions, but you can get in touch with us by email, reach out anytime. We love hearing from you. And like I said, please keep an eye out on the Generating Futures series, because we do have some more stories planned in the next few weeks and months. If you're not already signed up for the Narwhal's newsletter, that's the best way to find out when we publish new stories. We send it out every Thursday. And lastly, just a reminder that if you're not yet a member of the Narwhal, please consider joining and supporting this reporting. We couldn't do it without you. And the support of our 7,000 plus members is really what makes all of this possible. So thanks to those of you who are supporting the Narwhal. And I hope some of you are inspired to join us today and get a free tote. So thanks again so much for being here, and we'll let you go right on time.